Welcome, audience, to another episode of Cyber GPT Pulse podcast. Here I'm your host, Amir Sayed. I'm with another host who is much more evident about supply chain attack because in the recent months, some of you might heard about recent supply chain attacks, specifically from DJ Action on GitHub, and also there have been many evidence of these software supply chain attack, which needs to be looked on. So as we have done in past as well for various other podcasts and episodes, here we are presenting more expert knowledge on hand, which will help to the audience as well as the concerned companies to address these issues effectively. So here, Brian Gallagher, who is the CEO of Codelock, he has a vast experience in the field. So yeah, I would like to hand over to Brian to give a much more introduction of himself here.
Thank you. I appreciate you having me on today and talking to you and your audience. It's definitely an important topic and glad that it's one that I'm able to contribute to. So, at a super high level, just a little bit about myself. I've been in the security industry and realm for probably the last 25 years. Started in government, so I was initially with the United States Secret Service and working in their technical security division right after 9/11. Kind of coming up with some really cool different countermeasures to protect against threats that we were seeing at the time, but all within a physical security focus. I noticed that we were plugging all of these things into networks, and there was this massive cybersecurity threat that went alongside the technology that we were using in the physical security space. And so I was looking at what I wanted to do for a master's degree. I was thinking of getting an MBA. And I had a really wise advisor say, hey, maybe you should think about cybersecurity instead, just based on the way things are moving and where threats are shifting. So I did that, went and got a master's in cybersecurity and forensics, and that kind of pushed me into the whole cybersecurity role. Fast forward a little bit, back in 2020, we were working on some supply chain related issues. Ironically, looking at pieces and parts of drones coming from China into the United States when the SolarWinds attack happened, which was really the big spotlight in our industry on software supply chain attacks, and pushed me into really focusing in how to better protect companies and software from similar attacks in the future.
Yes, that's a very illustrated career you are having, and I think you should be already thanking your advisor with the cookies and stuff. He advised you in the right direction. The most challenging and most interesting field, which I and also most of our audience will agree, is cybersecurity, which keeps you on the toes, and you will never know what comes and hit you on the hits on the head. So just like that, supply chains of security has been another of those brick which is hitting a lot of heads now in the industry. So from your experience, what exactly you think is and can categorize as software supply chain attack? Just to give a bit of brief for those of the audience who don't understand this.
Yeah, I think that's a great spot to start in. So, what is a software supply chain attack, and what does that really look like? And people tend to think of supply chain, when you're building something from a hardware perspective, the pieces or parts that go into it, or maybe minerals and materials that are needed to create it. But software is really made up of a bunch of zeros and ones, right? And I like to think of it as Lego blocks, different Legos that my kids play with that are different colors and different shapes and kind of get snapped together to actually create something. And that's really how software as a whole is generated and created these days. And so the question is, well, where are those Lego blocks coming from? Is it coming from a vendor upstream that maybe you're purchasing part of that software? Is it a component that maybe is open source in nature, that developers are pulling in and using? Or is it the people? Is it contractors or somebody being outsourced, or a micro architecture approach on putting software together? All of that becomes part of the software supply chain. Now, what's a software supply chain attack? Back in the say the older days, but think back to the 1990s when you had viruses and you would open up an email or on AWL and you have a virus on your computer. Oftentimes that was singularly targeted, right? And similar with software, if I wanted to be a hacker and attack or try to breach an entity, I could focus on that end piece of software that they were using. Well, with the software supply chain attack, it's a whole different approach. The thought process is rather than attacking that end piece, we're going to go and attack the beginning portion of it while it's being built, while it's being made. That way, when it gets pushed out to the industry throughout that supply chain, hence the name, the piece of malware or infection is already there to be exploited by the hacker later on. So very fundamental way. I like to describe it as rather than putting poison in your bottle of water that you buy at the store, they're actually poisoning the well that is filling all the bottles that you're buying at the store. So it's addressing it at the source, which creates a much larger impact and makes it sometimes that much harder to detect and stop.
That's a great analogy of poisoning the well. It's kind of what exactly is, and we usually also call it pipeline poisoning. So yeah, it's kind of the same name, and yeah, those were the days. AWL and yeah, simple application, and you have to just focus on one application, and if that application is exploitable, be it from SQL injection or be it some backend connection, you have to just find one source, and then that's pretty much your focus. But right now, it's kind of you have moved from one point into a forest, so you have to just pick your choice of poison and start from there. And attackers have so much wider attack surface, so it's kind of a very difficult from perspective of product owner and companies. And that was the same thing which happened with GitHub. And so in the GitHub TJ compromise, do you want to map the same understanding that what exactly went wrong there?
Yeah, well, let's talk about that a little bit. And I think it's a great example because ironically, so many of these supply chain attacks or just software malware attacks in general all start in the same spot. And that spot has to do with credentials and credential theft. The bad guy, the bad actor getting access into that environment in the first place. We saw that in SolarWinds back in 2020 when the Russians were in their system for about 12 months or so before the attack was ever discovered. They often start these supply chain attacks with getting credentials, and that's exactly what we saw here with this recent spots bug GitHub Actions attack. The attacker ultimately stole a maintainer's personal access token and got access into some different repositories. And that was really the first step that happened. The next thing that they did is they created a rogue account. So they used those stolen credentials and ultimately added a disposable or a fake GitHub user account into that organizational setting, which allowed them to start committing different malicious acts of code and things like that into that GitHub Actions workflow. So it's kind of step one and step two. Step three was all about malicious workflows and getting really that rogue account, pushing that malicious GitHub Actions workflow into designated areas to leak secrets. So they wanted to get secrets out, tokens, information, things that they could use. And so this was actual code that was getting committed that was intended for a malicious intent. And so it was really that stage that the attacker is trying to push or alter malicious code in that repository. And as we see with most of these attacks, this typically happens, after access is obtained fraudulently, with a stolen token, or maybe an insider or something along those lines. the next thing they did is they ultimately hijacked the trusted GitHub Actions account, and so they modified a series of trusted dependencies, and that's that TJ Actions that is referring to, and ultimately created a backdoor environment to that. That allowed for different downstream actions to occur. So the compromised GitHub Actions portion was then used by downstream projects, and the big one that we heard about was Coinbase. And so they unknowingly started executing this malicious code in their environment, didn't know it was there, wasn't detectable, and it had gotten introduced into that supply chain previously. And so then the end result is this secrets exfiltration, and that's when different secrets were printed to the CI/CD logs by that malicious workflow, and leaking those different environment variables. So that was kind of the process flow at a high level of what happened. But it all started with people having access to an environment that they shouldn't have. And so, I tend to try to look there first when it comes to dealing with software supply chain attacks in general.
Yeah, that's a good explanation of the life cycle there. And actually, the main fallacy is always having the secret protection, not having secret protection in place in correct configuration, and with the GitHub Advanced Security having being a separate subscription. Many of the companies I have seen doesn't care about taking the advanced security in place and using the GitHub secret protection for them. So that was the one of the steps which can be a good step to complete there. But apart from that, there has been another update from GitHub. They actually now recommending their own GitHub token to be the priority on pad. Earlier, it was just a advisory. Now it's a strong recommendation. So that's a update and upgrade from their previous advisory just because of this attack. And many of the companies, like including yours, is working to have the hardened control on these GitHub Actions. So one of the organization which actually detected was using a hardened runner, and they were able to detect this before getting the backdoor installed. So it was just when the commit was commit was just done for the malicious pin. It was just detected at the same time. So that saved a lot of bigger organization. I think there were 23,000 organization who were using this action, and later on we found out this TJ action was not isolated, as you mentioned, that review dog, and there was another one which was found out that was the original originator of the whole attack chain, because the pad token was the original depot's pad token was used to access the other two. And yeah, the main target was Coinbase, but there could be a much worse attack, but it was pretty much safe this time. But never know, this could actually lead to a very longer ripple effect if it was not detected at the right time. So that's why the main issue is that how to mitigate or how to uh, safeguard from these attacks. So do you have some recommendations
Yeah,
for
let's
organizations
talk about
from
that
that? Yeah.
for a second, because as
Yeah.
you were just explaining what you were, what comes to mind is something that my business partner always refers to, and he was very involved after 9/11 with looking at all of the data that the U.S. government had related to the attacks that were going to occur. And what we found, or what they found, was that, hey, the information was there, in different pieces of parts, but we just didn't know that it was there. The right people didn't know where to see it. And so what he ultimately determined is that it wasn't a technical problem. It was a socio-technical problem. And I think we see the exact same thing when we're talking about software and software security. So you have products like GitHub that have different security features that can be enabled, that can be used to stop a lot of these attacks in different ways. Problem is the way that a software developer mindset works and what their day-to-day job is. And even that, as you go up to a CTO or a CIO, they're not focused on the security aspects of this mission. They're focused on coding and getting features out and doing it, quickly and being creative. Well, on the other side of the house, when you look at the security engineers or the CISO, they're also not software engineers. So now you have somebody who has the security mindset, who's ultimately responsible for looking for are secrets being leaked? Are these features and functions in place for security? And it creates a rift between the two groups. And from a security perspective, unfortunately, often the software developers are the ones who win that fight, because they're historically the larger entity in an organization. They're producing the product that's being sold or used. So they're part of the revenue generation process of what's happening. So what we found is that it's not that technology doesn't exist to stop this. It's that the right tools aren't available to the security engineers and the CISOs that are responsible for enforcing it. So I think from my perspective, one of the things that I tend to tell customers and clients and people that I'm talking to is, if you can give security a view into the development environment, but do it in a way where it doesn't negatively impact anything that the developers are doing, then that's a win-win. Security can do their job and the developers can keep on doing their job without being negatively impacted or affected. So that's where my focus is, and that's where we tend to focus on. How can we give those tools and those capabilities to the appropriate people, where everybody's happy and working together.
Yep, that's pretty much the gist of it. And these incidents does shows to not to blind trust any of these tools, and always verify, monitor, and keep the eyes on to how these tools have been used by the user access list in the user access list, and double checking them at every point of the pipeline. That's kind of can be done with pre-hooks as well. So pre-hook commit as well. So where we can have the various checks regarding the committed pin hash, and yeah, so those kind of help at least to identify those malicious uh, changes in the commit. So,
Yeah,
but
and
yeah,
kind of using a pre-hook feature is
yeah,
exactly right. I mean, we use that in our product set, on getting a trigger prior to a commit actually occurring, but then taking it a step further and actually creating a chain of custody for non-repudiation, so who did what, when, where, and why. And that's just a big part of the equation that people have ignored for so long.
yep, and keeping the chain of custody does help in the digital forensics compliance as well, because when various regulations demand that for you. So does the so where this where does asset management or having just a SBOM help you in this scenario? Because um, some of guys are also saying that, okay, yeah, if we have a SBOM, we do have some protection. Is that statement somehow correct, or is just a vague one?
Yeah. So I think that the SBOM's a big topic within itself. And for listeners who aren't familiar with an SBOM is a software bill of materials. I like to describe it as, think about when you go to the grocery store and you get a box of cereal and you see the nutritional label. It's telling you what's inside it, and are there things harmful in those individual ingredients. And if you remember when we were talking back to the Lego block example earlier, this will show you what are the different Lego blocks and where did they come from, and is there a vulnerability or a known vulnerability associated with that, right? So I think that an SBOM is critical to software security. But I think that a lot of people kind of define an SBOM in different ways. And so you look at really the concept of the SBOM first got introduced, at least within the US government, back in 2014. And it took about 10 years, a whole decade, to really get traction on it being used or implemented. So it really wasn't until 2021 when President Biden signed an executive order, the 14028, that really started shining a light on the SBOM as a whole. And then the U.S. Department of Commerce came out with a minimum basic guideline for what should be in an SBOM, formats, and things like that. Now there's working committees across industry, across government, one that's led by DHS and CISA, where industry and government and academia come together weekly talking about how to enhance the SBOM. How's it working in different organizations? What are pros and cons? How can we make it better? So it's going to continue to adjust and shift, and I think become more valuable to organizations. But I tell any CEO or any business leader, if you don't have insight into your own software, if you can't tell me what components are being used, what active vulnerabilities you have, then that's a massive liability to you and your organization. And the fact that we can literally generate that information in a matter of seconds now, there's no reason for an organization to not, at a minimum for themselves, understand what's in their own software. We can talk about should they be giving that to other people or allowing that to be openly, viewable, and there's pros and cons, to that in different ways. But internally, 100%, they should have access to that information.
Yeah, I totally agree with that. And even in my book, I gave the similar example of insightful grocery list being your in your pipeline. So I totally agree with that. And we do see a lot of traction because of uh, effort, but in the recent light, with what we had seen in past couple of days regarding MITRE and previously with NVD,
Yeah.
there might be a bit of detraction or of railing of these regulations. So I'm still seeing that having a better understanding that not just regulation, compliance to regulation is security. You have to have security in place, even though compliance or regulation is off track, because it's being safeguarding your critical asset in your system. Your copyright, your IPs in your system is much more important in this scenario, because we have in kind of a similar state of right now. So this can be escalated in various directions, but that's kind of a different off topic of geopolitics system. But this can need to be understood by leaders as well, that okay, yeah, we have to keep this, we have to at least know what we have in our system with the
Well, and I
SBOM.
think
And
that
yeah,
I think you brought up the point about MITRE over the last week, and it might be worth us talking about that just for a couple minutes,
yeah,
because I've had tremendous amount of conversations in the last 48 hours on this topic specifically. And I think that, for context, MITRE has a contract with the U.S. government, and MITRE being a nonprofit itself, but to be able to enhance the CVE and work on the CVEs that gets issued. Now, there are multiple databases that technology tools use for looking at CVEs and known vulnerabilities. There's a national vulnerability database. There's proprietary ones. GitHub has stuff. So I think there's probably about 12 to 14 different sources that we tend to look at internally for those known threats. But this is something that we've been talking about for a while, and I think people started asking themselves in the last 24 hours when it looked like the MITRE contract was not getting renewed. If you had to guess, or at least some of the stats that I tend to quote, there's about 1.2 billion known threats out there. Well, if you look at most of these databases and you look at the CVEs and things like that, there's really only maybe 3 to 5 million of those threats that are actually cataloged and tracked and used. So what the tools are doing is they're scanning code and they're comparing it to these databases of known threats. But it's really only looking at maybe 0.5% of the threats that they actually know that are out there, leaving over 99% of what we already know exists to not even be checked. But what makes it worse is look at all the 0 days. So with the uptick in nation state activity, particularly China, Russia, but then even with the introduction of AI, you can create malware so fast right now that it's never going to be on one of those databases in the first place. So you have to fundamentally think differently about how are we going to detect vulnerabilities, or how are we going to detect change in code when it occurs at a time that it shouldn't, and prioritize the research of those changes versus just the old way of comparing it to a database of known threats.
Yeah, I agree with that. So detection engineering has been a pioneer, has been a evolving in domain from a long time, but right now it's kind of getting a pioneer attraction because of the whole fact of AI, as well as the previous technologies getting making easier and easier to introduce new zero-day attacks. And with MCPs in place, we I think 2 weeks ago there was a Gitra MCP introduction, and one of the well-known reverse engineer who himself just denounced GPT, that GPT cannot build up anything regarding cannot do anything, any intersection in reverse engineering. He admitted himself that, yeah, no, now reverse engineering can be done with a simple MCP, and just a new beginner in the industry can reverse engineer and find out the backdoors, and uh, use the whole code its own modulation. That's pretty something, because doing it in current ideas or tools, it's kind of a huge task to complete it, even if you are doing with IDA Pro or Hydra. But with automation, which I saw with MCP, it's kind of you are just writing a prompt, and it's finding you the specific line of code where you can inject your malware or your backdoors, and it's just creating a simple platter for the attacker, where attacker need to just find and decide what they want to do. So
Yeah.
it's that easy. So now, yeah, so that's why organization need to keep up with this. I know it's very easier said than done, but yeah, that's why we have to be very realistic, that including proof of provenance, which has been a very adoption of SLSA from a long time in every software build, can be a way. But do you think it's very realistic to have this proof of providence, which has been mentioned in SLSA from time? Does that help in what we are talking today?
Yeah, it definitely does, and even the example you used where attackers can now understand what line of code to insert something into. Well, the name of my company is Codelock, and that's on purpose because we lock code and ultimately create a cryptographic hash of so many lines of these code. Other things that we patented, but the purpose of that is when that insertion then happens, it's going to break our chain and let us know that something got inserted and it shouldn't have. At that point in time, I don't care what it is, whether it's good or it's bad, but it shouldn't have happened. And so we want to know why and where, and give that back to our users to look at. And so it's that exact scenario that you're discussing that I think is key to being able to flag concern and flag change.
Yep. I think you hit the nail there. So having the secure by default is one of the definition which we usually use, and having the chain of custody is one translation of that larger definition, which many of the vendors are providing, and companies need to start looking into those solutions, which does help to have a to be better prepared for these pipeline attacks. And yeah, so from that thing, I think we had a brief discussion about what what are the lessons companies had learned and what can be the mitigation. So do you want to add something, what something like a couple of statements that what should be the
Yeah.
must
So
have?
from a
Yeah.
secure by
What,
default perspective,
yeah, what should be the must have which should be included by the organization so that they can be have some checklist that okay, yeah, these three four things which need to be done initially, because a lot of the organizations are on the very lower maturity and the resources are very constrained, even
yeah,
budget as well. So yeah.
I think kind of putting this in order. I'll give you three things. So I think having the ability to have an identity, kind of an identity bound commit process. So that's that code provenance and non repudiation piece. So since we know that most breaches begin with these unauthorized or unverified changes, being able to handle that as a step becomes very, very important. So, an MFA factor, biometrics, things along those lines. I think that the second point is something that you had brought up related to the software bill of material, and we can add dependency and vulnerability scanning to that, as a subpart. But as I mentioned before, if you're an organization that deals with software, there are zero reasons right now for you to not have an SBOM and have a real time software bill of materials where you can see it being updated as things change. So that's a very easy and useful tool, and it's something that's not expensive to do. And then I think a third part is that tamper detection portion. And so I think that can fall into your pre-deployment environment with some of what we've been discussing, but then also within your runtime environment as well. So post-deployment, but having the ability to detect when something is changed and tampered with when it shouldn't be. Those are really the three priorities that I would look at.
Yeah, yeah, and those are quite well-rounded recommendations, from having the a strict identity control to SBOM, and of course having a good detection engineering, even though if it is just logging and real-time alerts for initial setup, but later on it can be worked on to track everything in the pipeline. Uh, but yeah, initially these three items need to be start with. Every organization need to start with. So I will just, I think we have covered a lot of ground on technical perspective. I will just turn the table on yourself, just to get a bit of your personality. So when you are not doing any of those technical supply chain stuff, registering another pattern, uh, what exactly are your hobbies and adventures in your life?
Oof. So when I'm not working, when does that happen? First and foremost, family. I have two daughters that I just love spending time with and being with and just enjoying time with them. So that's one of the key things that I like to spend my time doing. But I'm also an outdoors person. So I live outside of Washington D.C., but in an area where we have data centers and 70% of the world's internet traffic running through really outside my window right here. To 10 minutes down the street, I can be out with wineries and horses and out on a tractor just enjoying the beautiful scenery and environment. So I think in my spare time, I like to do that. Be with friends, be with family, maybe go sit at a winery or out on a hike.
Okay, so I'm visualizing you sitting just like in the movie Theory of Everything. Stephen Hawking's visualizing a universe. You are visualizing universe of code, how to lock them and protect from your window in DC.
Hey, I've gotten some of my best ideas on my tractor outside in the backyard.
Yeah, you never know. It's kind of whenever your mind exactly feel free, you can get best of your ideas. You are not even working at that time. So yeah, I pretty much agree with that. So yeah, with that, we will just close today's episode. So in the show notes, there will be details about Ryan Gallagher and his. If anyone want to connect with him and know more about what he and his company is working, and yeah, for more such informative podcasts and shorts, as well as subscribe and like CyberGPT Pulse podcast, and we will connect again in the next episode with more exciting subject matter expert and guest to talk more insightful conversation in cybersecurity as well as AI. That's pretty much it. Bye from here, Ryan.
Thank you. Appreciate it.